So this is what passes for a political panel, discussion panel on Canadian mainstream media, right? It's a host and three journalists, all of whom have the exact same opinion about the topic being discussed. So in this situation, it's on the news and information program here in Canada called the National, which is the state broadcasters, the CBC, their flagship program. And the topic being discussed is the government in the province of Quebec has kind of taken a step back from their plans to mandate vaccines for healthcare workers, because there's been this widespread, very strong resistance to it, and there's a danger that thousands of healthcare workers will rather lose their jobs than take these injections. Now, besides the fact that everybody has the same opinion on the CBC about this issue, the other thing to really notice here that is particularly significant is that the perspective they are representing is the perspective of the government. It's the perspective of the state against the citizens, the Canadians who are opposing these measures. So the entire discussion is framed as this is the response of ordinary Canadians to these forced injections by the government is a big problem. And what should the government do about it? So have a look at this, and you'll see right off the bat that Rosemary Barton, who is the CBC host, how she frames this discussion that they're all going to have.
Became to push it back because there's real concern that they would end up with not enough people to work. We're talking thousands and thousands of people. Chantal, I'll start with you on this because you're in Quebec. Is this blinking first a concern that other provinces, the federal government, should be thinking about here?
So you can see the way the host, Rosemary Barton, has set this up, that this blinking first, how much of a problem for the government is this? And what's the government supposed to do in response to these citizens who are refusing to submit to their will? And is this a problem that could extend to other provincial governments and to the federal government, that they're going to have this problem with these citizens who just aren't doing what they're told? And she asked Chantal Hébert for her take on it. And this is what Chantal says.
Probably less so if you're not talking about workers that are so essential to make your health system operate. So if you're in a province where you have lots of them, maybe you can afford to just not blink. In the case of Quebec, there was just no choice. Now, that being said, that's not an argument against setting a deadline for people in the healthcare system to get vaccinated, because over that period until yesterday, half of the people who were not vaccinated in the system did start or get vaccinated.
So there's Chantal Hébert's take on it, right? Yeah, this is a problem for government. You know, it's having these citizens who just won't do what they're told and obey. But if, you know, in other provinces, if you have a lot of healthcare workers, then you can afford to have a bunch of them be fired for not obeying the government. But in Quebec, there's already kind of a problem with staffing and shortages in hospitals. So it would be a problem for them. But that's not justification for the government not forcing people to take experimental drugs that have been proven to have severe adverse reactions for some people and which have no mid to long-term safety profile. It's not an excuse not to impose that on those people, right? So the government better not use that as an excuse not to impose that on these people. And her take on this is strictly, this pragmatic kind of numbers game, right? How many nurses can you afford to fire? If you have a lot, then it shouldn't be a problem. That's Chantal's take on this. It's not about whether or not this is a good policy to begin with. No, actually, it's clearly in her eyes, it is a good policy. And the fact that it's causing all of these problems and threatening an already poorly staffed healthcare system, that's not the issue. The issue of forcing people to take drugs against their will, that's not the issue. The justification of healthcare workers to not be put in a position that they'll be made unemployed if they don't submit to taking these drugs, that's not an issue. It's strictly a numbers game of how many of these widgets can you afford to get rid of and it not upset your business model.
Beyond that, of course, it does cost you political capital, and one of the problems with that is that moral authority is what has gotten citizens to respect a lot of guidelines. And this is one of the first big times where moral authority has failed in the face of defiance.
Now, I find that extraordinary to hear this journalist talk about this in terms of moral authority. Moral authority. And according to Chantal, the moral authority rests with the government, with the state, with the political class. And it's that moral authority that they possess that has caused citizens to obey their will, to submit to all of these measures. And according to Chantal, this is the first example of that moral authority that the government possesses, that politicians possess, that the state possesses. This is the first example of that moral authority failing in the face of defiance. It's extraordinary. And you could not ask for a clearer demonstration that the journalist class in Canada identify with the state in opposition to the public, to the extent that they will openly assign moral authority to the state and define defiance to state demands as a defiance of moral authority. They're immoral for not obeying the government. It's extraordinary. And why is this a moral issue? Why is this being framed as a moral issue at all? It's supposed to be, we're keep being told, supposed to be an issue of science. It's supposed to be about a biological issue that the government is imposing measures that are supposed to have an effect on this biological issue that will result in a better outcome for people. This isn't about morality. It's about, are these measures justified? Do they accomplish something that has some quantifiable effect in the world? Is there a justification for overriding the will of citizens to this extreme extent where you're forcing them, the government is telling them you must inject these pharmaceutical products into you or we will assume the authority to render you unemployed and create a two-class system where you will be denied certain rights that are allowed to people who do obey us. It's extraordinary But this is the mindset of the media class, of journalists in Canada.
And that's interesting because it is in Quebec where there has been, some success in keeping that moral authority. Andrew, what did you make of the decision?
And there you have the host, Rosemary Barton, agreeing that yes, the government is the font of morality. They have the moral, that's where moral authority comes from, the political class. And Andrew, why don't you tell us how correct the government is now?
It sends a very bad signal, not just in Quebec, but to the rest of the country. It will embolden the anti-vaxxers, who we've discovered are much more numerous and much more determined than perhaps we had thought previously.
Andrew Coyne is terrible. Look at the language he's using. Look at how he's characterizing his fellow Canadians, thousands, millions of people. He's characterizing them in this way. There's more of them than we had thought. They're more determined than we had thought. Who the hell is we, Andrew? What is this we? He's talking about normal Canadians as if they're some kind of evil force within the country, who there's more of them than we thought. It's extraordinary. This is dangerous and demented language that he is using. And he's establishing this concept of we. The we is people who agree with me that the government should force people to do this, that our perspective is the official correct perspective. And then there's these other people who exist among us and you don't know who they are. This idea that there's these normal people who have maintained a perspective that was universally shared up until a few weeks ago, that people shouldn't be forced to take drugs against their will that they don't feel they need or want. That was the norm. And now that's been presented as some kind of, insidious force of that's corrupting society. It's extraordinarily dangerous, and it's demented. There's something wrong with people who are willing to indulge in this kind of us and them, those people over there who aren't doing what I think they should be doing. And this willingness to simply dismiss the will, the conscience of millions of people. They don't think what I think, doesn't matter. They should be forced to do what I want them to do. They don't want to be injected with something that I want them to be injected. What they think doesn't count. Thousands, millions of people. Doesn't matter. My will should override their will. And he just says it like it's a matter-of-fact thing. And everybody on the panel, oh, yeah, that's a great point, Andrew.
The calculation, I guess, of the government of Quebec was that they were so determined they'd rather lose their jobs than get vaccinated, or at least they weren't willing to test that proposition. But I don't think there's any other word for it but blinked. Perhaps if they are sufficiently strict and determined from this point on, that the damage of that can be unwound. Maybe some combination of giving a little here and then being firmer from now on. Maybe that will work.
The damage of that can be unwound, right? Andrew, again, the position here is that these people standing up for their own right to decide what drugs they take, that's damaging, right? And perhaps the damage of blinking can be unwound. And the way Andrew's thinking maybe they can unwind it is that they, pretend to kind of give a little here, but then they become more strict later, right? The entire position that Andrew is putting forward here is from the government. It's from the government's perspective. Well, what does the government have to do to deal with these people who aren't submitting to their demands, submitting to the will of the political class? What does the government need to do against these people? It's just blatant. It's not even disguised in any way.
But I would think it's going to send bad signals. And of course, they're not the only ones. If you look at the federal plan, They basically they're not, they don't have mandatory vaccines. You have to attest that you've been vaccinated. You have to show
Yeah.
proof, and supposedly they're going to audit all of these attestations. Well, I'll believe that when I see it.
Althea, I mean, you do have to allow, I think, for reasonable sort of uptake between when you make the threat and the deadline in hopes that that works. I guess they just need longer in Quebec, and maybe that's what other governments should think about too.
When you're threatening people, you have to give a little bit of slack to the people you're threatening. As the government, when you threaten your own citizens, you have to give a little bit of room for them to get used to it before you come down on them and force them.
Well, I'm going to split the issues up into two. I think for the federal government, the reason that they went with an attestation to begin with was because they couldn't really check everybody's vaccination status remotely, and they wanted to get things done by the deadline that they had suggested. I also don't think they're dealing with necessarily critical staff, not to disparage any of the work that federal public servants do, but they are not like life and death situations.
Not frontline workers,
like the nurses.
Yeah.
Exactly.
In short, it's different when it's politicians. They don't have to be forced into this in the same way that, people who work in the healthcare industry need to be forced to take drugs against their will.
Yeah.
And so I do not think that this is going to make the federal government change its course, even if there are lots of people in the bureaucracy who decide not to get vaccinated.
You see, if you're in the federal bureaucracy, it's just not that big a deal if you decide for yourself whether or not you take these drugs. It's only a big deal if other people think they can decide for themselves whether or not they take these drugs.
Quebec is facing, like many other provinces, but an acute staffing shortage when it comes to nurses. Like just in our region here in Ottawa, in Gatineau on the other side, there's 350 nurses that are required just to avoid having the current nurses doing overtime. Okay. So they're already dealing with a problem to begin with. And I think in some ways, it's hard to criticize a government for doing the right thing when it comes to people's health and safety. And you would want them to contingency plan. And if it takes them another month to sort out what it would mean if they have hundreds of nurses not showing up for work, then that is the wise decision. And I think that that is one of the reasons why you had opposition parties in Assemblée Nationale, for example, asking the CAQ government to do this.
You see, it's hard to criticize the government. After all, they're just trying to do the right thing for everybody's health and safety. And by the right thing, Althea means creating a situation in the middle of an ongoing nursing shortage whereby thousands and thousands of those nurses will either quit or be fired. It's hard to criticize the government for that. So there you have it. That's the state of Canadian journalism in Canada right now. And the thing that really stands out for me is that the single perspective that is represented throughout this entire thing is the perspective of the state, the point of view of the people with power who are imposing this on Canadians. The point of view of the people upon whom this is all being imposed never comes up. It's never addressed. Those people, those average normal Canadians, are characterized as some kind of insidious internal enemy. They are the them to Andrew Coyne's we in this scenario. So I find all this stuff very dark, very disturbing. This is not journalism.